In the coastal town of Crescent Bay, where the Atlantic hurls itself against weathered cliffs with the persistence of ancient grief, there lived a woman named Alara, who had learned to read the language of unspoken truths. The town itself seemed caught between centuries. Cell towers rose like metal prayers beside weathered lighthouses, while lobster boats equipped with GPS still bore the carved talismans their grandfathers had trusted more than any satellite. The mist that rolled in each evening carried with it the whispers of townspeople, and in Crescent Bay, whispers had a way of becoming gospel. They spoke of the old bloodlines, the families whose roots ran as deep as the tide pools, and of the curses that clung to certain names like barnacles to pier posts. Most dismissed these as quaint superstitions, relics of a more primitive time, but Alara had married into one of those names, and she was beginning to understand that some traditions survived for reasons more pressing than nostalgia. Her husband Darian was beloved in town, the kind of man who remembered everyone's children's names and never failed to help during the autumn storm season. He ran the maritime supply store with the easy competence of someone born to salt air, and his laughter could be heard 3 blocks away when he gathered with the other men outside Murphy's Tavern on Friday evenings. Yet at home, in the blue-painted cottage they'd shared for 7 years, he moved like a man carrying invisible weights. Alara had noticed the changes months ago, subtle as the shift from summer to fall. The way Darian's eyes would drift toward the horizon during conversations, as if listening for something only he could hear. How he'd begun taking his cigarettes outside, even in bitter January wind, claiming he didn't want the smoke to stain their walls that had absorbed decades of his father's pipe tobacco without complaint. Most telling of all was the way he touched her now, gently but distantly, like a man saying goodbye in increments. The townspeople noticed nothing. To them, Darian remained the golden son of Crescent Bay, descendant of the founding families, keeper of maritime tradition. But Alara had learned to trust the small stirrings in her chest, the intuition that hummed like a tuning fork when something was amiss. She'd felt it the night before her mother's stroke, the morning her sister's marriage crumbled, and now it sang a persistent, mournful note whenever she watched her husband step onto their porch for his evening smoke. In Crescent Bay, smoking had always carried weight beyond addiction. The old-timers spoke of it in hushed tones, how certain men took to tobacco when oaths were broken, when honor demanded a physical ritual of guilt. It was said that those who betrayed sacred trusts would find themselves compelled to breathe smoke, to let it curl from their lips like visible regret. The habit became both confession and penance, a mark that those who knew the old ways could read as clearly as a scarlet letter. Alara's grandmother had whispered such stories during childhood visits, tales that seemed harmless then, folklore to pass the time while kneading bread or mending nets. But watching Darian now, seeing how the cigarettes seemed to call to him rather than comfort him, she began to wonder if those stories carried more truth than poetry. The cottage they shared had belonged to Darian's family for 4 generations, perched on a bluff where it caught both sunrise and the full fury of nor'easters. Its windows faced the harbor, and from the kitchen table where they took their meals, Alara could watch the boats return each evening, their lights bobbing like fallen stars on the dark water. It was during one such evening, as October mist wrapped around their home like a familiar shawl, that everything changed. Darian had grown increasingly restless as autumn deepened. His smoking, once a casual after-dinner ritual, had become urgent, almost compulsive. He would rise abruptly from the table, sometimes mid-sentence, his hand already reaching for the pack in his shirt pocket. The explanations came in fragments: stress from the business, concern about the coming winter, the vague ailments of middle age. But his eyes told different stories, filled with a guilt so profound it seemed ancestral. On this particular evening, fog had begun its slow crawl from the sea while they shared a dinner of fish stew and brown bread. The conversation meandered through familiar channels: the harbor master's retirement, the plans for the annual Founders' Day celebration, the new family that had moved into the old Blackwood place. Normal things, safe things, the kind of topics that filled space without revealing much. But Alara found herself studying her husband's face, noting how his jaw tightened whenever the conversation lulled, how his fingers drummed against his thigh in a rhythm that matched no earthly song. "The Hendersons are talking about selling the boat," she said, cutting another piece of bread. 30 years they've worked those waters." Darian nodded absently, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the kitchen window where darkness was already claiming the harbor. "Times change," he murmured, but his voice carried a weight that the simple observation couldn't account for. "Do they?" Alara asked quietly. "Or do we just stop fighting them?" Something in her tone must have struck him, because his eyes snapped to hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might speak, really speak, with the honesty that had been missing from their conversations for months. Instead, he pushed back from the table with sudden decision. "I need some air," he said, already reaching for his jacket. The movement was too quick, too desperate, like a man fleeing rather than stepping out for casual relief. Alara watched him through the window as he stood on their small porch, the lighter's flame briefly illuminating his face. Even in that instant of orange light, she could see the tension in his features, the way he held himself like a man bracing against invisible wind. The cigarette's ember glowed and faded in steady rhythm, a beacon of distress that only she seemed able to read. It was then that she noticed his jacket, draped carelessly over the back of his chair. Darian was meticulous about his belongings, a habit born from years of working with marine equipment where carelessness could mean disaster. But tonight, in his haste to escape the intimacy of shared dinner, he'd left behind more than just his coat. Alara stood slowly, her heart beginning to race with the particular anxiety that precedes unwanted discoveries. The jacket was an old leather thing, softened by years of salt air and wear, its pockets shaped by the familiar weight of wallet, keys, and cigarettes. But as she lifted it to hang properly in the closet, she felt something else. The crinkle of paper, too thick to be a receipt, too deliberately folded to be trash. Her hand hovered over the pocket. In 7 years of marriage, she had never searched through Darian's belongings, had never felt the need to hunt for evidence of betrayal or deception. Their trust had been one of the foundations she'd built her life upon, solid as the granite cliffs that sheltered their harbor. But now, with that paper rustling against her fingertips like a whispered confession, she felt that foundation beginning to shift. Through the window, she could see Darian still standing in the mist, his back to the house. The cigarette had burned low, but he made no move to return inside. It was as if he knew, somehow, that this moment had been inevitable, that the weight of whatever secrets he carried would eventually demand to be shared, willingly or not. Alara drew the paper from his pocket. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, the kind used for formal correspondence rather than casual notes. It had been folded and refolded so many times that the creases had worn soft, creating a map of anxiety across its surface. As Alara unfolded it, she could smell something faint and unfamiliar. Lavender, perhaps, or some other floral scent that definitely didn't belong to their salt-aired cottage. The letter was handwritten in elegant script, the kind taught in expensive schools or inherited from mothers who valued such graces. The date at the top was just 3 days old. "My dearest Darian, I know this letter will cause you pain, but I cannot continue in silence while our daughter asks daily when her papa is coming home. Lily is 6 now, old enough to understand that promises can be broken, and I fear I can no longer protect her from that truth." Alara's hands began to tremble. The words seemed to float on the page, refusing to arrange themselves into comprehensible meaning. "Our daughter." The phrase repeated in her mind like an echo in an empty church, each repetition carrying more weight, more impossibility. "You said the binding would weaken with time, that the pull of your blood would fade and you could choose freely between your 2 lives. But it's been 6 years, my love, and still you disappear each month when the moon is dark, drawn back to that other shore like metal to lodestone. The curse runs deeper than either of us imagined. I understand now what your grandmother tried to tell me before she died. The Thorn Men have never belonged wholly to one woman, one life, one form. The sea claims you as surely as any human love, and perhaps more permanently. Each cigarette you smoke carries the smoke of old oaths, old betrayals. The nicotine doesn't soothe. It marks you, brands you as one who serves two masters. Alara sank into her chair, the letter fluttering in her shaking hands. Outside, she could hear Darian's footsteps on the porch boards, the slow pace of a man buying time. But she couldn't stop reading, couldn't turn away from the words that were rewriting everything she thought she knew about her life. Sarah, I can write her name now without jealousy. She suffers as I do. Told me about the morning she found scales in your bathroom sink, the way you sometimes speak in languages she doesn't recognize. We've compared notes, your two wives, bound together by shared confusion and love for a man who exists only partially in each of our worlds. The smoking ritual grows stronger, doesn't it? Your father experienced the same compulsion, and his father before him. It's not addiction, it's remembrance. Each cigarette is a small betrayal of one life in service to another, and the guilt manifests in smoke and ash. The townspeople recognize it instinctively, though they don't understand why they whisper about men who smoke with such desperate regularity. I'm writing to tell you that Lily and I are leaving for Boston next week. I won't raise our daughter to wait for a father who appears and disappears like morning mist. But I'm also writing to tell you that Sarah knows everything now. We met, finally, your other wife and I. She's as good as you said, as kind and intuitive. She deserves the truth. The choice is yours, as it has always been. But know that your daughter will grow up with stories of her father, not as a shapeshifter caught between worlds, but as a man who loved so deeply he became lost in his own heart. Perhaps that's the kindest version of truth any of us can hope for. With all my love and forgiveness, Marina. P.S. The old woman at the dock, the one who sells charms to tourists, approached me yesterday. She said the curse can be broken, but only if all parties choose forgiveness over revenge, understanding over anger. She said to tell you, the last cigarette must be the first choice freely made. I don't know what this means, but perhaps you will. The letter slipped from Alara's fingers and drifted to the floor like a fallen leaf. Through the window, she could see Darian grinding his cigarette beneath his heel, the ember dying with a tiny shower of sparks. His shoulders were set with the resignation of a man who had run out of time and options. For several minutes, Alara simply sat in the growing darkness, her mind struggling to process revelations that seemed to belong to someone else's life. Shapeshifter. Curse. Other wife. The words felt foreign on her tongue, like vocabulary from a language she'd never learned to speak. Yet underneath the shock, underneath the betrayal that cut through her chest like cold wind, something else stirred, a recognition that felt almost like relief. All those months of sensing wrongness, of feeling like she was married to a man who existed only partially in their shared space. Finally, those intuitions had context. The strange dreams where she'd heard him speaking in languages that sounded like whale song. The mornings when she'd woken to find sand in their bed, though neither had been to the beach. The way he sometimes looked at her with such profound sadness that she'd wondered if he was ill, dying of something he couldn't name. And the smoking. Dear God, the smoking. Now she understood why it had seemed so ritualistic, so laden with guilt. Each cigarette wasn't just a habit, it was a confession, a visible manifestation of oaths broken and lives divided. The old-timers who whispered about such things hadn't been trafficking in superstition after all. They'd been keeping alive knowledge that their grandsons would need. The kitchen door opened softly, and Darian stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of tobacco and sea mist. He moved carefully, like a man walking through a minefield, his eyes scanning the room until they found the letter on the floor. When he looked up at Alara, his face held no surprise, only the terrible patience of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. He closed the door behind him, hung his jacket on its proper hook, and sat down across from her at the table where they'd shared 7 years of meals and mundane conversation. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of generations. "I've known what I am since I was 16, he said. "I've known about the curse since my wedding day. But I didn't know about Marina until 3 years ago, and I didn't know about Lily until last Christmas." The admission hung between them like smoke from an extinguished candle. Alara found herself cataloging details she'd never noticed before. The way Darian's eyes reflected light differently in certain weather, how his skin seemed to shimmer sometimes when he was wet from rain or shower steam. Small things that her conscious mind had dismissed, but her deeper awareness had been collecting like evidence in a case she didn't know she was building. "Show me," she said simply. Darian's hands stilled on the table. "Alara, show me what you are." He looked toward the window where darkness pressed against the glass, then back to her face. Whatever he saw there, not anger, not fear, but a terrible kind of patience, seemed to decide him. He stood slowly and walked to the sink, filling a large bowl with water from the tap. The sound was ordinary, domestic, completely at odds with the strangeness of what was about to happen. "The change is easier near salt water," he said quietly, carrying the bowl back to the table. "But this will have to do." He rolled up his sleeves and plunged his hands into the water, closing his eyes with the concentration of someone performing a familiar ritual. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then Alara saw it, a subtle shifting beneath his skin, as if something was moving just below the surface. His fingers seemed to lengthen, becoming more tapered, and between them she could see the suggestion of translucent webbing. But it was his face that truly changed. The bones seemed to soften and flow, his features becoming more angular, more aquatic. His skin took on a subtle pattern, like light filtered through water, and when he opened his eyes, they had become entirely black, not the black of human pupils, but the fathomless black of deep ocean. "My grandmother called us pelagic," he said, and his voice carried new harmonics, like whale song wrapped in human words. "Children of the deep waters. We're born with one foot on land and one in the sea, and the curse of never fully belonging to either world." Alara found she could breathe again. The strangeness of what she was seeing somehow felt less foreign than the months of half-truths and careful silences. This, at least, was honest. "How many of you are there?" she asked. "Few. The bloodline thins with each generation, and the sea calls fewer children home." He withdrew his hands from the water, and slowly his features began to return to their familiar human configuration. "My father could become fully aquatic for hours at a time. I can manage perhaps 20 minutes before the water begins to burn my lungs. My son or daughter, if I have one, might manage only minutes." "Your daughter," Alara said quietly. "Lily." Darian's face crumpled with pain. "She doesn't know yet. Marina has been protecting her from the truth, telling her I'm away on long fishing trips. But she's starting to show signs. She can hold her breath underwater for impossible lengths of time, and sometimes Marina finds her talking to things in tide pools that nobody else can see." "And Marina? How did you meet her?" "In Halifax. I was working on a deep-sea fishing vessel, and she was a marine biologist studying whale migration patterns. She found me one night, changed, communicating with a pod of humpbacks." His smile was rueful. She thought she was documenting new cetacean behavior. Instead, she discovered her future husband. The story emerged in careful fragments over the next hour, Darian's words carrying the weight of long-held secrets finally given voice. How the curse worked, drawing him to sea during new moons, compelling him to take aquatic form and serve as a bridge between human and marine worlds. How his great-great-grandfather had broken an oath to a sea witch, condemning his male descendants to live between worlds as punishment. How each generation tried to break free, only to find the bonds growing stronger, more complex. The smoking started when Lily was born, he said, unconsciously reaching for his cigarettes before catching himself. Suddenly I had 3 lives to balance. Husband to you, father and partner to Marina and Lily, and servant to whatever calls me from the deep. The guilt became physical. The cigarettes appeared in my pocket one morning, and I found I couldn't resist them. The old woman Marina mentioned. What did she mean about the last cigarette? Darian shook his head. I'm not sure. But Mrs. Kettle, she's the one who sells charms down at the wharf. Her grandmother was said to know the old magics. If anyone would understand how to break a curse like this, it would be her bloodline. Alara stood and walked to the window, looking out at the harbor where lights bobbed on gentle swells. Somewhere out there, beyond the breakwater, was a world her husband knew better than the one they'd shared. The revelation should have felt like betrayal, like the collapse of everything she'd built her life around. Instead, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle she'd been unconsciously assembling for months. Do you love her? She asked without turning around. Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Differently than I love you, but yes. And I love Lily with a fierceness that sometimes frightens me. And me? Do you still love me? Alara. Her name in his mouth carried such tenderness that tears began to blur her vision. You are the anchor that keeps me human. Without you, I would have given myself to the sea years ago. She turned to face him, this man she'd married who was revealing himself to be someone entirely different yet somehow exactly who she'd always known him to be. The supernatural elements of his story were strange, impossible, but the core truth underneath was achingly familiar. A good man caught between competing loyalties, trying to honor obligations that were fundamentally incompatible. I want to meet her, she said. The next morning brought one of those crystalline autumn days when the air itself seemed polished, the harbor reflecting sky and clouds with mirror-perfect clarity. Alara had spent the night in their guest room, not out of anger, but from a need to think clearly, to process revelations that had rewritten the story of her marriage. She'd heard Darian moving through the house in the early hours, restless as always when secrets pressed too heavily against his chest. She found him in the kitchen, already dressed and clutching a cup of coffee like a lifeline. The cigarettes lay on the counter beside him, the pack nearly empty. In daylight, with his features returned to their fully human configuration, he looked almost ordinary, just a tired man facing a difficult conversation. But Alara found herself noticing details she'd overlooked before. The way his hair curled with the humidity as if still damp from sea spray, how his eyes seemed to shift color depending on the light, like water over sand. I called Marina, he said without preamble. She's driving down from Boston this afternoon. She wants to meet you. Alara nodded, surprised by her own calm. She'd expected to wake up angry, betrayed, ready to rage against the impossibility of her situation. Instead, she felt oddly peaceful, as if some tension she'd carried for months had finally been released. What about your other obligations? She asked. The sea, the curse? Darian's hand moved unconsciously toward the cigarettes, then stopped. The new moon is tomorrow night. I haven't missed a calling in 15 years, but... He looked at her with something like hope. Mrs. Kettle said she'd see me this morning. If there's a way to break this, or at least choose how to honor it, I want to try. They walked to the wharf together, past the familiar sights of morning, fishermen preparing their boats, tourists already browsing the craft shops, gulls wheeling overhead with their harsh, demanding cries. Mrs. Kettle's stall sat at the far end of the pier, a ramshackle collection of driftwood tables covered with shells, sea glass, and various charms that most visitors assumed were mass-produced trinkets designed to separate tourists from their money. Mrs. Kettle herself was ancient even by Crescent Bay standards, her face mapped with lines that spoke of decades spent squinting into salt wind. But her eyes were sharp as tide pool stones, and when she looked at Darian, Alara saw recognition there, not just of the man, but of what he carried in his blood. "You've told her," the old woman said without preamble, her gaze shifting to Alara. "Good. Secrets have weight, and you've been carrying too much for too long." "Marina said you might know how to break the curse," Darian said. Mrs. Kettle laughed, a sound like waves over shingle. "Break it? Child, your great-great-grandfather made a bargain with forces older than this town, older than the lighthouse that guides ships to safety. You don't break such things, you honor them or transform them." She gestured for them to sit on the weathered benches beside her stall, then reached beneath her table to produce a small wooden box carved with symbols that seemed to shift when Alara wasn't looking directly at them. "The cigarettes," Mrs. Kettle said, holding out her hand. "Let me see them." Darian reluctantly placed the pack in her palm. She examined it carefully, turning it over in her weathered fingers, even lifting it to smell the tobacco through the cellophane wrapper. "Guilt made manifest," she murmured. "Each one a small betrayal, each betrayal strengthening the bonds that hold you. But also," she looked more closely, holding the pack up to the morning light, "each one a choice consciously made. That's important." "I don't understand," Alara said. Mrs. Kettle smiled at her with unexpected warmth. "The original curse was meant to punish betrayal. Your husband's ancestor broke an oath of protection to pursue his own desires. But curses, like all magic, evolve. They take on the characteristics of those they bind. Darian's guilt has been feeding the binding, making it stronger, more complex. But guilt, unlike hatred, can choose differently." She opened the wooden box, revealing a collection of objects that seemed simultaneously ancient and recently made. Stones worn smooth by countless tides, shells that spiraled in patterns that hurt to look at too long, pieces of sea glass that glowed with inner light. "The curse binds you to serve two masters, the human world and the sea. But what if you could choose to serve both freely, not as punishment but as gift? What if the division between your lives became integration instead of fracture? Is that possible?" Darian leaned forward, hope brightening his features. "Possible, yes. Easy, no." Mrs. Kettle selected a piece of sea glass from her collection, holding it up so that morning light passed through it in shades of blue and green. "It requires honesty from all parties, forgiveness where forgiveness seems impossible, and the courage to build something new rather than trying to repair something broken." She looked at Alara with those sharp, knowing eyes. "You felt it, haven't you? The pull of deeper waters, the sense that your life was meant to be larger than the boundaries you've accepted." Alara nodded slowly, remembering dreams she'd dismissed as nonsense, visions of swimming through kelp forests, of breathing underwater, of communicating with creatures that had no names in human language. "The bloodline chooses its partners as carefully as it chooses its inheritors," Mrs. Kettle continued. "You carry the potential within you, dormant but present. The choice is whether to awaken it." "What choice?" Darian asked. Mrs. Kettle stood and walked to the edge of the pier, where waves lapped against barnacle-crusted posts. "Tomorrow night, when the moon is dark and the calling comes, you can answer it as you always have, alone, guilty, divided. Or you can answer it freely, with those you love beside you, transforming obligation into celebration." She turned back to them, her expression serious. "But understand, there's no returning from such a choice. You would all be changed, all bound to the sea service as well as the lands. Your lives would be larger but no longer entirely your own." The implications of her words settled over them like morning mist. Alara found herself thinking of Marina and Lily, of the life that waited in Boston, of the choice that would define not just her future but theirs as well. Marina arrived as the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the harbor in shades of gold and copper. Alara watched from the kitchen window as an unfamiliar car pulled into their driveway, her heart beating with the peculiar rhythm of momentous occasions. She'd imagined this meeting countless times since reading the letter, but reality proved more complex than any scenario her mind had constructed. Marina stepped from the car first, a tall woman with auburn hair that caught the light like flame, moving with the fluid grace of someone equally comfortable on land or water. Behind her came a small figure that could only be Lily, 6 years old and vibrant with the restless energy of childhood, her dark hair so similar to Darian's that the resemblance struck Alara like a physical blow. Darian met them at the door, and Alara watched through the glass as her husband, their husband, knelt to embrace his daughter. The child's face lit up with such pure joy that Alara had to look away, her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. When she looked back, Marina was watching her through the window, their eyes meeting across the space that separated them. Alara. Marina's voice was warm but cautious as she entered the kitchen, Lily clinging to her father's hand with obvious reluctance to let him go again. I've wondered about you for so long. They studied each other with the careful attention of women who shared an impossible situation. Marina was beautiful in the way that spoke of depth rather than surface. Intelligent eyes, a face that revealed character as much as bone structure, hands that moved with the precision of someone accustomed to delicate work. But what struck Alara most was the kindness in her expression, the complete absence of the jealousy or resentment she might have expected. I brought pictures, Marina said, producing a tablet from her bag. I thought you might want to see. The photos told the story of a life lived in careful segments, Marina and Darian walking along unfamiliar beaches, Lily building sandcastles while her father watched with devoted attention, family moments stolen from the spaces between his other obligations. But it was the later pictures that held Alara's attention. Images of Lily playing in tide pools, seemingly communicating with creatures that should have fled from human presence. Photos of the child sleeping peacefully on a boat deck while dolphins swam alongside. She's manifesting earlier than Darian did, Marina said quietly. Last month, I found her having what appeared to be an actual conversation with a harbor seal. When I asked her about it later, she said they were discussing the best places to find clams. Lily had been exploring the cottage with the fearless curiosity of childhood, but now she approached Alara with shy directness. Are you Papa's other wife? She asked with the brutal honesty of the young. I am, Alara replied, kneeling to meet the child at eye level. And you're his daughter that I've been waiting to meet. Mama says you didn't know about us. That must have made you sad. It did. But I'm not sad now. Lily considered this with solemn attention, then nodded as if Alara had passed some test. Papa smells different when he's sad. Like storms and deep water. Do you smell that too? Alara glanced at Darian, who was watching this interaction with visible anxiety. I do, she said. I've been smelling it for months. Mama says he won't smell like that anymore after tonight. She says we're going to help him choose differently. Lily looked between the three adults with the expectation of someone who had learned to trust in solutions beyond her understanding. Are you going to help too? The question hung in the air like a challenge, or perhaps an invitation. Alara realized that this child, born between worlds, saw possibilities that adult minds might dismiss as impossible. In Lily's universe, it was perfectly reasonable that 3 people could love one man and find a way to make that love work, that ancient curses could be transformed by conscious choice, that families could be built in configurations that defied conventional wisdom. Yes, Alara said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. I'm going to help too. They spent the remaining daylight hours talking, sharing stories, building the foundation of understanding that would be necessary for what lay ahead. Marina spoke of her years loving a man who appeared and disappeared like weather, of raising a daughter who asked questions no parenting book could answer. Alara shared her own experience of sensing wrongness without context, of living with someone who was only partially present. "I used to think he was having an affair," Alara admitted as they prepared dinner together. "A conventional affair would have been simpler." Marina laughed, but not unkindly. "I wondered about you too. Darian spoke of you so rarely, but when he did, his whole demeanor changed. I knew he loved you differently than he loved me, but I could never decide if that made it better or worse." "How do you mean differently?" "You ground him," Marina said simply. "I understand his strangeness because I'm strange too, in my own way. But you love him in spite of his strangeness, and that love keeps him anchored to humanity. Without it, I think he would have given himself completely to the sea years ago." As evening approached, they made their way to the harbor where Mrs. Kettle waited with what appeared to be half the town's older residents. Word had somehow spread, as word always did in Crescent Bay, that something significant was happening. The townspeople didn't fully understand what they were witnessing, but they recognized its importance with the instinct of people whose ancestors had lived by tides and omens. Mrs. Kettle had prepared what could only be called a ritual space at the end of the pier, using symbols drawn in what looked like phosphorescent sand. The design hurt to look at directly, seeming to shift and flow like water, but it radiated a sense of completion, of old debts being settled. "Are you ready?" she asked Darian, who stood between his two wives with Lily clinging to his hand. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the pack of cigarettes, now down to a single tobacco cylinder. In the gathering dusk, it seemed to glow with its own light, as if the guilt and longing it represented had become visible. "The last cigarette," he said quietly. "The first choice freely made." He placed it in Mrs. Kettle's outstretched palm, and immediately the air around them seemed to thicken, charged with the potential of transformation. Out in the harbor, the water began to phosphoresce, as if responding to some deep disturbance. "Now," Mrs. Kettle said, "choose." The calling came with the rising tide, a pull so strong that Alara felt it in her bones despite having no hereditary connection to the sea's ancient demands. Darian's body went rigid beside her, his face turning toward the water with the inevitability of iron drawn to lodestone. But for the first time in 15 years, he didn't move immediately to answer. "We do this together," he said through gritted teeth, "or not at all." Mrs. Kettle stepped forward, the single cigarette still glowing in her palm. "The binding requires acknowledgement of the old betrayal before it can be transformed. Speak the words your ancestors should have spoken." Darian closed his eyes, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the water itself. "I acknowledge the oath broken by my blood. I acknowledge the debt inherited by my line. I offer freely what was once taken by force, service to the boundary between worlds, protection for those who travel between sea and shore." The cigarette in Mrs. Kettle's hand began to dissolve, becoming smoke without fire, dispersing into patterns that wrote themselves across the darkening sky. As it disappeared, something seemed to lift from Darian's shoulders, a weight he'd carried so long that its absence left him momentarily unsteady. "And now," Mrs. Kettle said, turning to Alara and Marina, "the choice that transforms curse into gift." The water in the harbor had begun to glow more brightly, and shapes moved beneath its surface. Not quite human, not quite other, but something that bridged both possibilities. Lily watched with delight rather than fear, clapping her hands as what appeared to be dolphins swam in complex patterns around the pier. "The sea recognizes willing servants," Mrs. Kettle explained, her voice carrying easily over the sound of waves that had grown suddenly rhythmic, like a vast heartbeat. "But the binding requires consent from all who would be touched by its magic." Alara looked at Marina across the space that separated them, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in the other woman's eyes. To accept would mean abandoning the life she'd known, the simple human existence she'd built in this cottage by the sea. But to refuse would mean watching Darian disappear piece by piece into obligations he could never fully honor, until nothing remained but guilt and the ghost of the man she'd married. What exactly are we consenting to? Marina asked practically. To become bridges yourselves, Mrs. Kettle replied. To serve as guardians of the boundary between worlds, protectors of those who travel between sea and shore. Your lives will be longer, richer, more complex, but they will no longer be entirely your own. The old woman gestured toward the glowing water. The sea has been waiting for willing partners rather than reluctant servants. Darian's bloodline was bound by betrayal, but you can choose service freely. The curse becomes covenant, punishment becomes purpose. Lily tugged on Marina's hand, her face bright with excitement. The dolphins are singing, she whispered. They're welcoming us home. And Alara could hear it now, a melody that seemed to rise from the water itself, wordless but full of meaning. It spoke of depths that held wonders beyond imagination, of creatures ancient as tides, of a world that existed parallel to the human realm but infinitely vaster. The song didn't demand submission. It offered partnership. If we do this, Alara said slowly, what happens to us? To our bodies, our humanity. You remain yourselves, Mrs. Kettle assured her. But you become more than yourselves as well. The change will manifest differently in each of you. Some may develop the ability to breathe underwater, others might learn to speak with marine life, still others could find themselves able to navigate by currents invisible to human senses. The sea grants what each person needs to fulfill their role. Marina was studying the phosphorescent patterns in the water with the trained eye of a marine biologist. The bioluminescence, she said wonderingly. It's not random. It's responding to our emotional states, isn't it? The boundary between worlds grows thin when witnessed by willing hearts, Mrs. Kettle confirmed. What you see now is the sea's true face, usually hidden from human perception. Darian stepped forward, placing one hand on Alara's shoulder and the other on Marina's. I won't ask you to do this for me, he said quietly. The choice has to be yours, freely made. But know that whatever you decide, I'll find a way to honor it. Alara felt the weight of decisions settling around her like a tide. She thought of the small, safe life she'd built in Crescent Bay, teaching at the local elementary school, tending her garden, sharing quiet evenings with the man she'd thought she knew completely. It was a good life, peaceful and predictable, but had it ever truly satisfied the restless longing she'd carried since childhood? She looked at Lily, who was leaning over the pier's edge to trail her fingers in the glowing water, completely unafraid of the magic that surrounded them. This child would grow up between worlds whether they participated or not, but she could grow up with family who understood her gifts, who could guide her through the complexities of her dual nature. I've always felt like I was waiting for something, Alara said finally. I just never knew what it was. Marina nodded slowly. And I've spent my career studying the ocean from the outside, wondering what secrets it held. This feels like completion. They stepped forward together, the three adults and one child who would become something new. Mrs. Kettle began to chant in a language that predated written words, her voice weaving harmonies with the song that rose from the sea. The phosphorescent patterns in the water grew brighter, more complex, and the shapes moving beneath the surface became more defined. Place your hands in the water, Mrs. Kettle instructed. Speak your consent to the sea itself. One by one, they knelt at the pier's edge and touched the glowing water. The liquid was warm, almost alive, and it seemed to recognize each person who made contact. Darian spoke first, his words carrying the relief of a man finally free to choose his path. I offer my service freely, not as payment for old debts, but as gift to the world that bridges land and sea. Marina's voice was steady with scientific wonder. I offer my knowledge and curiosity, my desire to understand and protect the mysteries of deep waters. Alara found words she didn't know she possessed. I offer my capacity for love, my strength to anchor those who might otherwise be lost between worlds. And finally Lily, her child's voice bright with delight. I offer my friendship to all the sea creatures who are lonely, and my promise to keep their secret safe. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The water beneath their hands began to glow more intensely, and they felt a tingling sensation that started in their fingertips and spread through their entire bodies. It wasn't painful, but it was profound, a rewriting of their cellular structure, an integration of human nature with something far older and more mysterious. Alara gasped as her vision suddenly expanded, showing her not just the surface of the harbor, but its depths as well. She could see fish moving in schools like silver ribbons, could perceive the underwater landscape of rocks and kelp forests as clearly as if she were swimming among them. More than that, she could sense the emotional states of the creatures around them, the dolphins' joy, the fish's cautious curiosity, even the contentment of barnacles clinging to the pier posts. Marina was laughing with wonder as her scientific mind processed new forms of sensory input. "I can taste the water's chemistry," she marveled. "I can feel the temperature gradients, the current patterns. It's like having access to an entirely new spectrum of reality." Darian's transformation was the most dramatic, his features shifting between human and aquatic forms with fluid ease. But for the first time, the change seemed joyful rather than compulsive, chosen rather than demanded. And Lily simply giggled as a young seal surfaced beside the pier and began what was clearly a conversation, the child responding to sounds no human ear should have been able to interpret. "It is done," Mrs. Kettle announced, stepping back from the ritual circle. "The curse is broken, the covenant established. You are bound now not by betrayal but by choice, not to punishment but to purpose." The townspeople who had gathered to witness began to applaud, though Alara suspected most of them didn't fully understand what they'd seen. In the way of coastal communities, they would create their own explanations, a renewal of marriage vows, perhaps, or some artistic performance related to the town's maritime heritage. The truth would become legend, legend would become folklore, and folklore would keep the secret safe for those who needed to know. 3 months later, Alara stood in the kitchen of their cottage, expanded now to accommodate their unusual family, watching Lily teach a group of harbor seals to play a game that resembled underwater tag. The child had adapted to her dual nature with the resilience of youth, splitting her time between regular school and what they'd come to call sea lessons with the various creatures who had become her teachers and friends. Marina had taken a position at the Marine Research Station that had recently opened in Crescent Bay, her enhanced abilities allowing her to gather data that was revolutionizing the understanding of marine ecosystems. Her published papers, carefully edited to remove the more impossible observations, were attracting attention from researchers worldwide. Darian had expanded his maritime supply business to include what he privately called boundary services, helping lost swimmers find their way to shore, guiding confused whales away from shipping lanes, and serving as an unofficial liaison between the human and marine communities. The townspeople had noticed his uncanny ability to predict weather patterns and locate missing vessels, but they attributed it to the kind of inherited maritime wisdom that ran in old families. And Alara had discovered that her role as an anchor worked both ways. Not only did she help keep Darian and Marina grounded in their humanity, but she found herself serving as a bridge for other townspeople who sensed the strangeness that surrounded them but couldn't quite name it. Children, especially, seemed drawn to her, sharing dreams of swimming with dolphins and stories of conversations with crabs that most adults dismissed as imagination. The changes hadn't been without challenges. Learning to manage enhanced senses, adapting to a metabolism that craved both human food and what Marina had termed oceanic nutrients, navigating the complex emotions of a marriage that existed in triplicate. All of it required patience and creativity. But what surprised Alara most was how natural it felt, as if she'd been living only a fraction of her potential life and had finally been allowed to expand into her full self. They'd established routines that honored both their human and marine obligations. 3 nights each week, they would take the boat out beyond the breakwater and slip into the sea in their enhanced forms, joining the community of creatures that lived in the deep waters. Lily had proven to be a natural ambassador, her child's lack of fear opening communications with species that had remained separate from human contact for centuries. The cigarettes had never returned. Mrs. Kettle explained that guilt made manifest could only exist when choice was absent. Now that Darian was serving willingly rather than under compulsion, the physical markers of that internal conflict had simply dissolved. On this particular evening, as winter began to release its grip on the coast, they prepared for one of their regular deep-water gatherings. The boat that had once seemed barely adequate for day fishing had been modified with Marina's scientific expertise and Darian's maritime knowledge to serve as a platform for their expanded activities. "The humpbacks are returning early this year," Marina reported, consulting instruments that measured far more than conventional oceanographic data. "They're bringing news from the southern waters." "Good news or concerning news?" Alara asked, helping Lily into the specialized wetsuit that accommodated her partial transformation. "Both, probably. The sea carries all kinds of information, not all of it welcome." Marina's expression grew thoughtful. "But that's why we're here, isn't it? To help sort through what needs attention and what can be left to natural processes." As they motored out beyond the harbor, Alara reflected on how completely her definition of natural processes had expanded. What had once seemed supernatural now felt like the normal operation of a world far more complex and interconnected than she'd previously imagined. The curse that had seemed like a burden had revealed itself to be an invitation to participate in something larger than individual human concerns. The humpbacks were waiting for them in the deeper waters, their massive forms creating phosphorescent wakes as they moved through the sea. When the families slipped into the water in their enhanced forms, the whales greeted them with complex songs that conveyed information about ocean temperatures, shipping routes, and the general health of marine ecosystems across vast distances. But tonight there was something else in their communication, a sense of anticipation, of change approaching that would require careful navigation. As Alara floated in the dark water, her enhanced senses picking up layers of meaning in the whales' songs, she understood that their transformation had been part of something larger. The sea was preparing for challenges that would require new kinds of bridges between human and marine worlds. "There will be others." One of the whales sang in harmonies that resonated through water and bone. "The time of hiding grows short. The boundaries weaken, and choices must be made." Swimming beside her, Darian translated the more complex portions of the whale's message for Marina and Lily, though the child seemed to understand more than she should have been able to. The ocean's ancient intelligence was awakening to new possibilities, and families like theirs would serve as pioneers in whatever came next. As they floated together in the phosphorescent water, surrounded by creatures that had welcomed them as partners rather than intruders, Alara felt a profound sense of completion. Not the completion of ending, but of beginning. The satisfaction of finally understanding her place in a story much larger than she'd ever imagined. The mist that rolled in as they made their way back to harbor carried with it the whispers of townspeople, and Alara knew that new legends were already forming. Stories of the family who could calm storms and find lost ships, of the child who spoke with seals, of the woman whose garden bloomed with impossible abundance, because she watered it with enhanced understanding of natural cycles. These stories would join the folklore of Crescent Bay, becoming part of the cultural memory that kept ancient wisdom alive. Future generations would hear them as entertainment, never suspecting that they contained practical information about the true nature of the world. And perhaps someday, when the sea called other lonely souls to expand beyond the boundaries of conventional life, these stories would serve as invitations rather than mere tales. The transformation they'd undergone hadn't been an ending but a beginning, the first notes of a song that would continue long after their individual voices had joined the eternal harmony of tide and current. Standing on their porch that night, watching the harbor settle into its peaceful darkness, Alara thought about the letter that had started everything. Marina's words about choice and forgiveness had proven prophetic, but in ways none of them could have anticipated. The truth in Darian's pocket hadn't destroyed their marriage. It had revealed the possibility of something larger, more complex, but ultimately more satisfying than what they'd had before. The last cigarette had indeed been the first choice freely made, but it hadn't been the last choice they would face. Every day brought new decisions about how to honor their expanded obligations, how to balance their human needs with their marine responsibilities, how to raise a child who belonged to both worlds while preparing for others who might need the same guidance. As the fog rolled in from the sea, carrying with it the familiar comfort of home and the endless possibility of deeper waters, Alara smiled. Some stories ended with happily ever after, but the best ones ended with happily ever beginning. And their story, she knew, was just getting started. The sea had infinite patience, infinite stories, infinite possibilities for those brave enough to accept its invitation to become more than they had ever imagined possible. In Crescent Bay, where the mist carried more than salt and secrets ran deeper than the tide, that invitation was always present for those who knew how to listen. And sometimes, when the conditions were just right and the boundaries between worlds grew thin, you could hear it in the wind, a song that spoke of transformation, of love that transcended conventional boundaries, and of families built not by blood alone but by the conscious choice to serve something larger than themselves. The townspeople would whisper of it for generations to come, never knowing that they were preserving the truth in the only way it could be safely kept, wrapped in the protective embrace of folklore, waiting for the next souls brave enough to step beyond the shore of ordinary life and into the vast, welcoming mystery of the deep.